much of the activities of double agents, of informers, they've been concentrating on the IRA. But at least in the latter half, because he had been spying for British intelligence for 2 decades. I mean, he was spying on Sinn Féin, a political party.
At the latter part before he confessed, before he was outed, yes, he would have been someone who would have been close enough to those negotiations that were going on that he might have been of use to, at that stage, to the establishment and the intelligence services, is just to know the direction that Sinn Féin were going. Remember, at that stage, there was a lot of really big ticket issues that had not been dealt with. You know, police and justice being one of them. Sinn Féin hadn't signed up to policing then. There was dissent within their ranks. The intelligence agencies would have been obviously really keen to be known who was that dissent, who among the leadership top team was not keen on the direction, who was. What was their bottom line? You know, what were they willing to negotiate on? What were they not? Because you go into a negotiation, you go in with your top line and you go, this is where we are, we're not moving. But everyone knows that, there's a bottom line as well. Was Denis feeding that back thing? I think originally he was clearly recruited as an IRA informer. At that stage, there wouldn't have been much interest, I suppose, in the political direction of Sinn Féin. But in the latter years, clearly he was very useful to the British government. And also, and not to go into conspiracy theories here, there are elements of the intelligence agency at that time who were not keen on the political process. Some people were not keen on Sinn Féin being brought into government at all. They still considered Sinn Féin the IRA. They didn't see that there was any difference between the two. They felt that a lot of what was happening was a reward and that they shouldn't have been receiving the treatment they were. And so there was elements of those intelligence agencies which were working to a different agenda maybe than the government of the time was working. So look, there's all sorts of Machiavellian hands being played here. There's all sorts of smoke and mirrors. There's all sorts of people working, to some of them for an agenda that was only for themselves, to push themselves on. Look, even when we got the Canova report, just over a week ago, when we got that and we looked at that, we did see that after Scappatisci's usefulness as an informer in 1990, because he wasn't at the centre of IRA operations anymore, they still kept him on because he was useful in terms of being able to say, well, this is what Republicans are saying in the street. This is what some people are saying in terms of the peace process. This is where the dissent is. That boy there's a chance he might go off and join the dissidents or set up his own organisation. No, there's still a worth to these people, even in those peace process days. But Denis Donaldson was more than that. He was working in Stormont. He was working in Sinn Féin's offices. He knew exactly what was going on at the heart of that political process. So you can see, looking back now with hindsight, that he would have been quite useful.
He said he was a British agent. He was recruited in the 1980s after compromising himself during a vulnerable time in his life. And since then, he worked for British intelligence, the RUC special branch, and that he was paid money. So he wasn't turned for ideological reasons. They found out something about him and they used it against him.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of rumours about that, what it is, but we don't know and we may never know. The money situation, like he didn't live, we've heard that of informers who did live lifestyles with, earnings above what they might have been considered. Denis Donaldson lived in a council house in Namona and, off the Mona Road in West Belfast. Like, he didn't live a flash life. Do you know what? I remember at the time whenever he was outed and he admitted being an informer, and someone who would have been good friends with him went, like, we couldn't believe it. More so, the boy wouldn't even have bought a drink. Like, when it was around, he used to come and go to the toilet and come back again. He was notoriously known for being really tight with his money. And now we're here that he's, been getting big pay packets of brown envelopes of cash from the British Army as he was going along. It's, it was a story that shook a lot of people, who, especially those who knew Denis Donaldson, because you might have had suspicions about some people, but he wouldn't have been one of the people you'd have had suspicions about.
He quit the party, fled across the border. First he went to Dublin and then he went to a remote cottage in County Donegal. So
he actually went to a religious order of nuns in Dublin and stayed with them for a while, which again is a bizarre twist to this story. So he, first of all, went across the border. He was dropped off outside a convent where I think he had some sort of connection with the people who were in there. Maybe that was, I don't know how he had, but he stayed in with a religious order for a while and then we know he did that press conference, and that was in Dublin, where he admitted on camera that he had been working as an informer for both Special Branch and for military intelligence for, as you said, 2 decades, that he had been turned during a vulnerable time, that he was receiving money for that. And And that was, I suppose, you're hearing that from the horse's mouth. In previous, we only had something similar, and that was the Freddie Scabatici press conference where he denied that he was an informer in fairly similar circumstances, looking pretty dishevelled, looking quite nervous, but still denying it. But here we had Denis Donaldson saying, "Yes, I am."
That's 20 years ago now that he was murdered. Now, there are new details have emerged around this.
Well, look, I'm not sure. I think that a lot of it is details that just hadn't been all pinned together again. This was huge at the time. It was an enormous, a story that was on the front page of every single paper. But then the news agenda moved on. Denis Donaldson was murdered. That was huge news as well. But it did move on. But then earlier this year, we had all of this obviously come back into the news agenda as part of that very well publicised libel case between Gerry Adams and the BBC.
The origins of this story, well, obviously they go back to the 1980s, but the origins of this chapter of this story go back to Stormont Gate.
They do. And I mean, Stormont Gate again, I remember I was working as a journalist at that time, and we see the dramatic footage of, Land Rovers rolling up to Stormont. The devolved assembly was in its early years. I mean, it was a pretty precarious government anyway at the time, given the fact that everything that was going on. It wasn't a particularly stable form of government at that time. You could argue it's not a particularly stable form of government now, but it wasn't particularly stable. But you see then the pictures of shocked-looking Sinn Féin workers as rows of, TSG, heavily armed, riot police dressed comes scooting up the stairs to search their offices. It was very dramatic. It was very politically important at the time, and it ultimately caused devolution to collapse and stayed collapsed for several years. That was one of the biggest gaps that we had in terms of devolution, and it was very early days for that to happen, and there was then a lot of discussions about the peace process and was this ever really going to work. So it was hugely damaging to the political process at the time, to the peace process. And then this phrase, Stormont Gate, which was to do with what was alleged to be the gathering of intelligence. It was claimed that Sinn Féin were publicly being political, but behind the scenes they were still gathering intelligence just in case. It was who knew what was going to happen. So among the intelligence that was recovered from a rucksack that was in Denis Donaldson's house and a laptop that was in a woman's house in West Belfast. And the reason why I'm saying a woman and not naming her, even though she was named at the time, is this person was completely and utterly innocent of any of this. She was someone who I think had some brief role in maybe canvassing at some point for Sinn Féin, got a knock at the door, was asked to mind something within a very short period of time, was arrested, had no idea what was on this laptop, and that was shown to be in court. So she was completely exonerated in relation to that. But the rucksack and the laptop had the names of every serving prison officer working in Northern Ireland at that time, and that cost the state millions, because every one of those who wanted to be had to be relocated, which meant their house had to be bought by the state under the SPED scheme, and they had to be given a new home, they had to be given new security. Can you imagine, when you think about what we're talking about now, about the PSNI data breach and how much that cost, when in reality those police officers were all getting, what, £1,200 to £1,700 each? This was tens of thousands to each officer. It cost millions. It was shambolic, and there was other information as well. So this became a really big, I suppose, story at the time. Political story more than anything else.